All right, so let's get right into it. Picture this. Napoleon Bonaparte is at the absolute peak of his power. He seems completely unstoppable. And then he makes a catastrophic mistake. He gets himself bogged down in a war that will bleed his empire dry for 6 long years, a conflict he himself would later call his Spanish ulcer. This is that story.
Now, what's so incredible about this is that, this isn't some historian looking back and judging him. This is Napoleon, in his own words. After it was all over, in exile, he admitted that this war was the fatal knot that led to his downfall. What a stunning confession from one of the greatest military minds in history.
So that's really the big question we're going to try and untangle here. What exactly was this fatal knot? How on earth did a military operation in Spain, which should have been straightforward, just spiral into a total disaster that brought an empire to its knees?
To really get it, we've got to go back to 1807. Napoleon is, for all intents and purposes, the master of Europe. He's smashed Austria, he's crushed Prussia, he's beaten Russia. There is only one major rival left standing in his way.
And of course, that rival was Great Britain. Now, he couldn't beat their navy, so he decided to wage economic war instead. He created something called the continental system, which was basically this massive, continent-wide embargo designed to choke the British economy by shutting every single European port to their ships. But there was a leak in the system.
And that leak was Portugal. As Britain's oldest ally, they just refused to ditch their trading partner. For Napoleon, whose whole plan depended on everybody falling in line, this was totally unacceptable. And this one small act of defiance is what set the whole tragedy in motion.
On paper, the plan looked so simple. Step 1, get your ally Spain to sign a treaty that lets your troops march across their country. Step 2, send in an army to take over Portugal. Step 3, plug the hole in your blockade. Easy, right? What could possibly go wrong?
Well, as it turns out, everything. See, Napoleon wasn't happy with just crossing Spain. He decided he wanted to own it. And this is really where his strategic genius gets completely overshadowed by his own imperial arrogance.
He summons the Spanish royal family, who were already a mess of internal squabbling, to France, and he basically forces them to give up the throne. Then, he just hands the crown to his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. He actually thought he could just swap out a dynasty that had been there for centuries and that the Spanish people would just accept it. He was so wrong.
The reaction was immediate, and it was violent. The ordinary people of Madrid, we're talking shopkeepers, workers, regular citizens, they grabbed whatever they could find as a weapon and just attacked the French soldiers in the streets. It was this raw, explosive outburst of fury against a foreign army. The French response was just as brutal. As the artist Goya captured so chillingly in his famous painting, the very next day, French firing squads rounded up hundreds of Spanish civilians and just executed them. This was meant to be an act of terror to crush the rebellion. But instead, it lit a fire that spread across the entire country, uniting a fractured people against a common enemy.
And this really gets to the heart of the problem for the French. They were absolute masters of the conventional battlefield, of army versus army. But they weren't fighting an army anymore. They were fighting an entire nation, a whole population that simply refused to be conquered.
So this new kind of war, this People's War, it started to drain the very lifeblood of the French Empire. It became this nagging, painful wound that would just never heal, what Napoleon himself called the Spanish ulcer.
The French were suddenly caught in two completely different wars at the exact same time. On the one hand, you had a professional, disciplined Anglo-Portuguese army led by Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, fighting them in big, set-piece battles. And on the other hand, they were being constantly bled white by an unconventional war of raids, ambushes, and sabotage waged by Spanish partisans.
And in fact, this is where we get the word guerrilla, which is Spanish for little war. You had farmers, priests, even bandits, who would come out of nowhere, strike French patrols and supply wagons, and then just melt back into the countryside. Their methods were brutal and effective. They couldn't beat the French army in a straight-up fight, but they sure could make it impossible for that army to operate.
Now, to deal with this two-front nightmare, Napoleon had to pour a staggering number of troops into Spain. At its peak, the French had something like 350,000 soldiers in the country, a colossal force.
But here's the absolutely mind-blowing part. Of that huge army, more than half of them, over 200,000 men, were not fighting Wellington's army. No,
They were stuck on guard duty, protecting forts and endlessly patrolling roads and supply lines. The Little War was literally paralyzing the Big One, and that created a weakness that Napoleon just could not afford.
And that paralysis would prove fatal in the pivotal year of 1812. Just as Napoleon was facing his greatest test somewhere else, that Spanish ulcer, it began to hemorrhage.
So while this brutal war is still raging in Spain, Napoleon assembles the largest European army ever seen to go and invade Russia. But his Grande Armée was missing hundreds of thousands of his most experienced, battle-hardened veterans. Why? Because they were all still stuck in Spain.
And then, things started to unravel with breathtaking speed. In June of 1812, Napoleon marches on Moscow. Just 1 month later, with French forces in Spain stretched thin, Wellington wins a huge, decisive victory at the Battle of Salamanca. And by August, the Allied army marches right into the Spanish capital, Madrid.
Suddenly, the entire French position in Spain just collapses. They're forced to abandon the whole south of the country, and the great port city of Cadiz, which had heroically held out against a French siege for 2.5 years, was finally free. From that point on, the war was pretty much lost for Napoleon.
Now, over the next couple of years, Wellington would drive the French all the way back over the Pyrenees Mountains and out of Spain for good. But the legacy of this incredibly brutal war would end up reshaping not just Spain, but the entire world.
So why does this all matter? Well, for one, the constant drain of men and money was a direct cause of Napoleon's final defeat. The conflict also created the modern playbook for guerrilla warfare. It gave birth to the Spanish Constitution of 1812, a radically liberal document for its time that inspired revolutionaries all over the world. But the cost was just immense. It shattered the economies of Spain and Portugal. And with Spain's power broken, its colonies in the Americas saw their chance and began their own fights for independence, changing the map of the world forever.
You know, in the end, even the Duke of Wellington, the man who won the conventional war, he admitted that the victory really belonged to something unique in the Spanish people. This stubborn, unbreakable will to be free that the most powerful army in the world simply could not crush.
And that leaves us with this final, timeless question. From the streets of Madrid in 1808 all the way to conflicts happening in our own time, the Peninsular War is this powerful, bloody reminder. What really happens when pure military might goes up against the will of a people? It's a question history keeps asking, again and again.